But in fairness, and in the the spirit of a new year, an election year coming up, I think maybe to open up, we can talk about a little something that has been going on for a while, but I feel like resetting the terrain on it is sort of worthwhile, which is the continued fear mongering around not only immigration, but a particular thing that Donald Trump and the Republicans have been pushing for a while, which is this idea that illegal immigrants are coming into the country and voting and flipping the election. If not for Trump, for a long ass time they've been doing this. No, I mean, all nonsensical stuff. But let's just sort of walk us through the different versions of this argument, at least from some of the loudest folks out there. And maybe to start with, no one better than the big man himself, Mr. Donald Trump, talking about this in Iowa just the other day. Also, apologies, folks, or just note, this is a pulled video from some right-wing influencer guy, so there is going to be some scare cuts in here.
Gratuitous, objectification of migrant people.
The last remnants of our open and broken border are crumbling into rubble as millions and millions of people storm into the United States in the largest illegal mass migration in the history of the world. And part of the reason they want them to come in is, in my opinion, they're signing them up to vote. And I believe that's why you're having millions of people pour into our country. And it could very well affect the next election. And I believe that's why they're doing it.
And look, we're focusing on the Twitter here because I think it's very important, actually, because this is where a lot of this stuff is being disseminated, not just from people like Donald Trump, but other elected officials, as we'll get into in a second. And I mean, look, with Trump, it's one of those things where, Trump still denies the election in 2020. Trump will say anything that sort of, inflates his, not just ego, but, whatever he thinks is going to play well with the crowd. There are different versions of this argument, but it's a continued one that I've been hearing this from the right wing for a long time, right, Matt? But typically it was a little bit more of a fringe, kind of weird, maybe county sheriff, elected official guy, or a big Alex Jones fan. How explicit and mainstream it's becoming within the Republican Party should give folks pause. Obviously, Trump has been pushing this for a while. People like Tucker Carlson have been pushing this for a while. Elon Musk, as we're going to get into in a second, have been pushing this for a while. But we've been getting versions of this from the new Speaker of the House, from other members all across the Republican Party, that basically there's this big plot to flip elections by getting illegal migrants, giving illegal migrants the ability to vote.
Yeah, it got our section on with Joe Rogan with Stavros Halkias, a comedian I'm a fan of, nuked by copyright. But that was his argument, which is that look at all these migrants in Chicago. People are protesting it, saying, "Hey, maybe I'll vote for Trump because I hate this so much." And Stav's like, "Well, why do you think they're doing that?" Just a sidebar: the reason they're doing that is because we have an influx of migrants that need to be processed in this country, and rather than letting them stack up at an airport during the holidays, Chicago's trying to find a place to house them. But that's not, available to Joe Rogan because his answer was to vote and control elections. So they were trying to piss off their own voters that were now into Trump, maybe, with people who can't vote. And Stavros said, like, yeah, my dad's immigrant, he can't vote. And Joe Rogan's like, well, they were thinking about it. And there actually isn't movement on that at all in Chicago. There is in other places, like San Francisco, for instance, is looking at maybe letting people vote in school board elections because children of undocumented people go to school. And they should. And actually, that is something that even Republican presidents used to affirm in like the 90s. And it's a sign of like a fascist turn in this country that we have moved away from that. And in part because the Democrats are just as willing with Republicans to prefer the killing of immigrants in the Rio Grande River to the prosecution of bosses.
Mm-hmm. No, and as we've seen, one of the notable things has been the continuation of Trump border policies under Biden, which is a much bleaker picture, by the way, than Trump's argument that there are just pure open borders. But just sort of walking through this gallery, another kind of classic version of this is something from Ted Cruz, senator from the state of Texas, who tweeted this out and has been saying things like this forever. December 15th, illegal aliens should not be able to vote in federal elections, period. This should not be controversial. And again, just being very clear, and I'm sure everybody out there, listening to this knows this. You cannot vote in the United States federal elections if you're not a citizen of the United States. It's just not a thing that happens. Across the board in this country, there are all sorts of nets and attempts to make sure that people who are voting are actually registered and legal voters. And the Brennan Center, for example, in 2017, examined 42 local jurisdictions around the country in the 2016 election, including some of the most populous counties in Arizona, California, Florida, and Texas. Of 23.5 million votes cast, election officials only found about 30 cases of potential non-citizen voting that they referred for prosecution or further investigation. And as is important to note, and just really quick for folks, that is from ABC News. Trump suggests unauthorized migrants will vote. The idea stirs his base, but ignores reality. But as is noted here and is noted all across, any kind of journalistic outfit worth their salt, is that the penalties for illegal voting in this country, especially for non-citizen, are stark. Including fines, prison times, and deportation. So the idea that, there's just all these people just like, shrugging their shoulders and voting, it's not something that has been proven. And it's something that most people understand the threat of.
Exactly.
So they, no one even tries. Another one just from that ABC piece, a Georgia audit of its voter rolls in 2022. This is Georgia, right? A Georgia audit of its voter rolls in 2022 found fewer than 2,000 instances of non-citizens attempting to register to vote for 25 years, none of which succeeded. Millions of new Georgia residents millions of new Georgia voters registered during that period. Look, and at a certain time, it's almost a little dweeby to sit around here and like fact check these guys because it's an emotional plea, right? It's not something that is based in reality. It's trying to invoke this sense that America is changing and it's under threat. And actually, you're not just sort of out of step with the times and maybe changing demographics or changing populations in this country, but actually there is some kind of nasty secret plot by the government.
Right.
Ted Cruz will respond when people say, "Hey, Ted Cruz, there's no proof that there has been any kind of, any examples of serious coordinated voting by migrants, undocumented migrants in this country." Ted Cruz will then note that, there are cities in the United States that are allowing or are moving to allow or maybe have had referendums or ballot initiatives on the question about whether or not non-citizens should be able to vote. Places like D.C. In New York City, there were attempts to do this. I believe there was in Vermont, San Francisco, Oakland, and a couple other places, all with varying degrees of success. A lot of times, these attempts, by the way, are just blocked by courts. Other times they are meddled with by the United States Congress, as sort of happened in D.C., where there were attempts because all of the laws in D.C. are reviewed by Congress because D.C. residents do not have the same rights as other Americans. There was attempts by Congress to sort of limit their ability to make decisions about residents of D.C.'s ability to make decisions about who should be able to vote in school board kind of things. Anyways, to get to the point here, the argument of Ted Cruz that like basically there's an attempt to expand the voter rolls with people who are voting in certain contexts and not others, so that maybe more and more people can slip through the cracks, is again just completely unsubstantiated, as somebody like Ted Cruz should know. So it's the kind of way of playing politics. And Ted Cruz, I think, better than the rest of them, because, Ted Cruz plays a dumbass on TV. That's like what his thing is. But the guy's, he's a nasty guy, but he knows what's going on. He reads, he understands things. When he makes these kind of arguments, he is trying to sort of target lowest common denominator folks, people who aren't really going to investigate too much, are going to hear somebody like Ted Cruz say, like, well, actually, there is a controversy around this. No matter how ridiculous or nonsensical or unsubstantiated, that is the kind of thing that gives legitimacy to Donald Trump's just sort of missives. That's the more sophisticated version there. Go ahead, Matt.
No, I think that you're exactly right to say that this is all, by even like engaging in the conversation, you're granting a premise that this is a real problem and not just a hysterical plank of a campaign for presidency, which has existed since Trump lost and didn't accept that he lost and needed an excuse for why he lost. And it was because there's all, and what's terrifying to me kind of actually is I've been listening to some other sort of like comedy type podcasts, some in the UK, of people who, they're not Trump supporters, but they'll even say things like, look, I think there might have been some fuckery against Trump, but not enough to have cost him the election. And it's like, there might be instances of people voting and they shouldn't have. When you actually look at those instances, often they're Republicans. But here's the thing: is like on a structural level, it's fucking ludicrous to point to that as if it's any sort of like anything else than what it is when Bolsonaro does it in Brazil, which is an excuse to throw discredit elections that you might lose, and people need to understand it as that.
And fundamentally, that's like the issue here is because, the Republicans have been, attempting to, restrict the right to vote in this country for a long time. And they do it because they don't want certain groups of people to vote. American citizens. They don't want American citizens across the board, certain populations of American citizens to be voting. So they make it more difficult. So more and more people fall through the cracks, right? And they need two things. They need an excuse for why they're doing that, other than just sort of like, hey, we would like it to be more difficult for these groups of people to vote. And the argument has always sort of been like, well, shouldn't it be secure, the right to vote? Instead of actually looking at like the mass disenfranchisement of American citizens that happens when they sort of push these more punitive voter registration, voter ID laws.
Yeah, and there's like this thing of, if that's such a foolproof strategy, granted that like they can't vote. But if it's such a foolproof strategy, maybe Republicans should join the arms race and let some migrants in themselves, and will then like vote for them. Maybe like a party turning against any sort of immigrant to a country is a disgusting thing for that party to do, especially in a country where, like, Trump could say like our border's crumbling. Our border has never done what anybody in government seems to think it, whether it's Joe Biden or Republicans. Like, that is a fucking permeable thing. We've never stopped traffic across that for people. We need to protect labor rights for those people and human rights for people that cross it. And we need to stop compelling people to be refugees in the first place, which maybe let's not destroy Venezuela's oil economy, for instance, or maybe let's do some reparation for that so people can stay there. God forbid, but that would be working with a communist, right? Like, so it's wild how we don't have that conversation, because there is, despite how hysterical Stephen Miller might get about how Joe Biden is, undermining the country, they're fundamentally closer on this than they like to let on.
No, and I think that's the thing that's really, really dangerous here is that because as the right continues to try to push these things, a lot of people in the American public sort of think it's like, well, Joe Biden has been pursuing these certain kinds of policies that are the exact opposite of the Republicans. When no, Biden has actually worked with heroic effort to actually maintain and make permanent a lot of the policies of the Donald Trump administration, which is another reason why a lot of this kind of why American politics can feel so bleak. This went a little bit longer than intended, so I did just want to jump to this really fast on our kind of gallery of nasty motherfuckers to another guy who, look, everybody who watches this program knows Matt and I don't like this guy, Elon Musk, but his recent kind of fixation with the border is just extremely disgusting to me. One, because of what it is that he's advocating, but two, as a personal thing, nothing infuriates me more than when people come to Texas and then they start getting real, to be Republican freaks and get really worked up about the border. Not to mention somebody who is an immigrant themselves to this country. Now, Musk has gone to the border and taken very disgusting photographs of himself, basically using migrants as props. But this, again, goes to something that I think is fundamental about Elon Musk, is the way that he has sort of bolstered some of the dumbest motherfuckers out there. And I don't think it's a small coincidence that these are people who pay him money. But this is something where, this is something where this guy, for whatever reason, now has, well, we know why, but this guy now has significant influence in what Americans are seeing on their phones, at least. And he is just inundating people with just nasty, stupid propaganda, and oftentimes things that are just flat out fucking false. even in the context of what is being shown to you on the screen. Like you don't even need to do a deep dive. You just do the reading instead of what's being shown to you on the screen. This is a recent one from Elon Musk who goes, Arizona clearly states that no proof of citizenship is required for federal elections. And I was saying to Matt before we get into this, and we'll look at this in just a second. If Elon Musk wants to play this role that he's trying to play here of, being a new kind of, poster boy of the right wing, he needs to learn the landscape a little bit, right? Because Arizona is not a state that you look at for woke border policy and woke voting rights policy. In fact, what he is talking about here, and we can look at it really quickly, the reason that Arizona has this stipulation in its voter registration system is because the voting restrictions that have been put in place in Arizona are so out of step with federal policy and federal guidance on what is needed that they have to actually stipulate a separate system, a bifurcated system, to be able to vote in Arizona state elections and in federal ones. But we can look at this really quickly. Sorry.
Basically, we'd like to do poll taxes, but we get in trouble for doing that. So if you object to our poll tax, we'll give you a federal only ballot one. Yeah,
I think that's a very quick and easy way to look at it. I mean, just so no one watching thinks we're being tricksters or anything like that. It's not going to let me zoom in too much, but the highlighted portion here is if you do not submit proof of citizenship and we cannot acquire your proof of citizenship from the Arizona Motor Vehicle
AKA
Division.
Sorry, David, but AKA the extra onerous step that puts too much onto people who want to vote that we want to do here.
Yes, which has only federal races and no state, county, or local races or initiatives. Anyway, it's very clear if you do a little bit of research, or even if you know anything about politics in this fucking country. And this is the reason that not only is Musk kind of dangerous because of what he is advocating for, but he's also dangerous because we're watching a stupid guy with a lot of personal confidence, sort of sleepwalking through political education, learning about American history, learning about American politics, and is bolstering some of the guy, no surprise there that Elon Musk was retweeting there is a Bitcoin guy. No surprise that person doesn't have very strong reading fundamentals. Look, and if anybody has ever, is oh, well, I'm not even going to argue for or against the Arizona laws here, right? But this context that they're talking about, have you ever voted in an election, Matt, where for whatever reason, maybe you had moved recently, when you showed up at your polling place, right? They didn't have your ballot, so you might have cast what's called a provisional ballot. And a lot of places you will do that. If you go there and you say, I have a right to vote, I'm going to vote, you're not going to turn me away, they will give you a provisional ballot. And if you get a provisional ballot, then it will be checked to see if it's valid later. It's not the same system there, but I'm just saying for anybody who's confused as to why, this kind of system is because, why you would have a system like this in the first place is because, when you run a big bureaucracy, sometimes things get mixed up, right? Either on the state side or on the voter side. None of this, anyways, that's just basic fucking understanding about how voting in America and in democracy works in the first place. The other thing it's exceptionally clear is none of this is saying in the thing that Elon Musk is retweeting there, in the actual facts of the law in Arizona, none of this is saying that Arizona is now basically allowing for illegal migrants or undocumented citizens, undocumented migrants to be voting in the United States. No, this is Arizona having to comply with federal policy, which, by the way, and there's a whole other can of worms we could talk about another day. It's ridiculous that we even let states administer elections at this point instead of the federal government. It's one of the most unique things about America. It's a disaster every time. All this freak out about fucking machines and all this kind of stuff. No, the fact that we have a patchwork system here with no kind of clear rules from state to state, that's a disaster. And it's not a disaster because, again, people are casting illegal votes. It's a disaster because it's too difficult for Americans to vote. Because if you were an American citizen, I think that you should be able to vote, and it should be something that is easy and accessible for you to do. And that's not going to happen as long as we let states run that system.
And you shouldn't need to go get a fucking driver's license first and go do this or that. You should be able to fucking vote. It's ridiculous. And the idea, and even granting the idea that, well, what about, that's not a problem. It's not a problem that our elections are influenced by a foreign voter base, and it's just hysterical, and it's borderline. It's like the first step on the yellow brick road of replacement theory type hysteria, and I just think it's ludicrous how much even Democrats play into this. Oh, we got to be sensible. We got to do this or that. John Fetterman now making a name of like, well, I don't, despite my wife being an immigrant, I now think we got to play ball with Republicans. It's
Mhm.
a bleak. It's bleak what politics does.